generally, Mark is the source of Matthew and Luke. What has happened in history is that scholars have worked with the basic assumption, which was held in the church for a long time, that they worked with the basic assumption that Matthew was written first, because Matthew was known to be a disciple of Jesus. At least there was a disciple of Jesus with that name, Matthew. And scholars have just basically followed that assumption, Matthew written first, and then Mark, a lesser known person, obviously making a summary of Matthew. But then scholars, noticing the relationship, they wanted to see what is the relationship between Matthew and Mark and Luke. Okay? So they try to reconstruct a source. Let's call that the source for these three, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So the more they reconstructed that source by looking at similar wording in the three of them, the more that source began to look like Mark's gospel. So scholars began to look at the source as not Mark's gospel in particular, but an or Marcus. Or meaning source. So a source of Mark's gospel. So we go from the source of Mark's gospel, then to Mark's gospel, which then becomes the source of these two. But the difference between the or Marcus and Mark are so slight that for practical purposes we stop mentioning or Marcus and we just simply mention Mark. But that simply means that we have to be aware, when we're putting it in this simple way, that Matthew and Luke just simply copied from Mark, that there is another source of Mark, which in fact, I've got it here not quite correctly, but a source of Mark, which is not only the source of Mark itself, but it's also the source of Matthew and Luke. So Matthew and Luke are not so directly from Mark, but from the or Marcus. So the arrow goes to Mark, but also goes to Luke and Mark and Matthew. All right? And for simplicity, we just forget about this more complex picture, and we just put the arrows from Mark to Matthew and Luke, bearing in mind that if we just think of that, there will be exceptions, such as this exception here. But that doesn't destroy the theory about or Marcus being the actual source.
Yeah. I mean, you can look at the Gospels and you can see the parallels between passages that they copy. They look like in Matthew and Mark, they're definitely parallels, but they have come from the source. But the way they pick, though, is you're picking that the statement in Luke is earlier than the one in Mark, because of your own preconceived notion that there is a degree that Jesus had gone from being just a man to being made into the Son of God. That's your preconceived idea. It's the way you're picking between those two statements. Because we don't have any actually documentary evidence of there being this Marcus or Q or whatever you want to call it. So that's the way you pick which source you think is earlier is by your already preconceived notions. And so that's not a reliable theory, by deciding that particular version is earlier because it fits my preconceived notions. And your reference to the Holy Spirit being declared part of the Godhead just in the council of whichever one it was at the end. Mm-hmm. If you look at the writings of the early church fathers like Tertullian and stuff from like the 100s, 200s, they're already regarding the Holy Spirit as God, even those early church quotes. So it's not a late development.
True. Okay, about the Holy Spirit, obviously it is true that some of the church fathers, and as I said, even within the Bible, you have passages which seem to indicate that the Holy Spirit is an individual person. But I was speaking about the official declarations here. When does it become, like even if you have some individuals thinking about it and writing about it, when does it become like an official pronouncement of church teaching for all and sundry? This is when so there's development, so you can say in between there is still further development until it comes to be pronounced, still some more development in the writings of church fathers and so on, till it finally comes to be pronounced. But when you mentioned my theory, I don't want to take credit for that because I'm just simply trying to recount what I've learned from biblical scholars. I didn't invent this, I didn't make it up on my own, I didn't even discover it. I'm just a student of this tradition. which describes the formation of the Gospels in this way. So they're great biblical scholars. One can pick up very important sources for learning Christianity today. The Anchor Bible Commentary, for example, the New Jerome Biblical Commentary, the Pelican New Testament commentaries. All of these confirm that, according to the views of the scholars who write them, that Matthew and Luke actually were borrowing from Mark. And it's not because of a preconceived notion that it went from here to here, that Jesus grows bigger. It's just from looking at the individual pericopes. Like you take one episode in the Gospel according to Mark, and you compare it with Matthew and Luke, and you see that there is a development. It's going from Mark to Matthew and Luke. It's not going the other way around. For example, if one looks at the Greek language that is used, that is something beyond me to describe this or to discover it, but the scholars are saying that often Matthew and Luke take what is in Mark and obviously polish up the Greek. So the same thing represented in better Greek. And it is inconceivable that Mark, in copying Matthew and Luke, would so change the Greek to make the Greek look bad. That's just on a simple level. But when we think of the actual image of Jesus, the way he appears in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you can see that there are improvements. For example, in Mark's Gospel, Jesus comes up to John the Baptist to be baptized. And the impression is that he comes to be baptized for the forgiveness of his sins, just like anybody else. The impression. Matthew and Luke correct that impression, or at least diminish it. Luke just simply says when Jesus was also baptized. So it's a quick mention, out of the way. Not too much to ponder about there. Then Matthew has it that Jesus comes up to John the Baptist, and John the Baptist says, "You have come to me to be baptized, but I need to be baptized by you." So, according to commentators, like for example in the New Jerome Biblical Commentary, there's a problem here for the writer in that if Jesus comes up to John the Baptist to be baptized, then it looks like John the Baptist is conferring some sort of a blessing on him. And that shows that John the Baptist is superior, or at least the reader might get that impression. So to reverse the impression, to correct it, Matthew would say, he has this story about John the Baptist demurring to Jesus. So you see, one after another, the story is being improved. If in Mark's Gospel we read that Jesus went to a place and he healed many people, then somebody may be asking, why didn't he heal them all? Well, in Matthew and Luke you do have it that he healed them all. If in Mark's Gospel, for example, in Jesus' hometown, you have it that Jesus in his hometown could not perform many miracles and he wondered at the unbelief of the people. Well, in Matthew in particular, we read that in his hometown he did not do many miracles, as opposed to could not do many miracles. In Mark's Gospel, Jesus heals a blind man, but he does it in two stages. First, he does something to the man's eyes, and then he asks the man about the result, and the man says he sees people appearing like trees walking. Obviously, he's seeing something, but still very blurred. And then Jesus does it again, and then the man is completely healed. So you have that episode missing from Matthew and Luke. So this is interesting because usually every episode of Mark is copied except for three. And there are three problematic passages from the point of view of the later idea that Jesus is something more special, much more so than a prophet of God. So it is clear from just studying the individual episodes that there is a development going that way. It's not going the other way. It's hard to imagine that Jesus was depicted to be God from the very beginning, and then somebody wrote Mark to show that, well, he has limitations. What do you think of Mark chapter 13, verse 32, where Jesus says, "Of that hour knoweth no man, neither the Son, not the angels in heaven, neither the Son, but only the Father." So if Jesus here is the Son, he doesn't know when the last day will occur. That's Mark chapter 13, verse 32. It's repeated in Matthew, but omitted from Luke. So you have the episodes in Mark always repeated, either in Matthew or Luke or in both. So the common factor in all of them is Mark, and Mark is easily the source of the other two. I wanted to just refer to that passage of God. You're saying it was Luke what?
23. Yeah, 22, verse
69 and 70.